This is the Great War Discussion Group. The topic for today is madness in uniform. Stephen Dietz has done a deep dive into the uniforms available and used in the Austro-Hungarian Army, and he may be working his way toward a general rule that the more uniforms an army has, the less effective it is. But I will let him take over. Stephen, you're on the air.
Thank you. Now, the reason why I use the term the madness in part, and we'll get into this more detail in a bit, is that's the way I feel after this point in the project that I'm working on. The sources that I'm utilizing all of them have come from the museum archives. As it states, if fashion and uniform diversity were weapons, the Austro-Hungarians may have won because it's an amazing mishmash is the only word for it. The sources utilized for today, everything came from the museum archives. These are from an acquisition in 2019. And it's part of a project that I've been helping museum archive staff work on. And it's over 4,500 postcards and photographs. At first, I thought it was about 3,500, but it did a recount, and it's really closer to 4,500. The pictures and photographs are primarily Austro-Hungarian, but other countries as well. And that it comes through an entire spectrum of what is the Austro-Hungarian Empire from pre-war through post-war. I have to state up front, I'm not a subject matter expert on Austro-Hungarian uniforms, merely an interested party. These photos came from a true subject matter expert. He wrote 2 books on the topic, but I want to show the impact of what happens when you have an empire that is starting to fail, and then a confederacy type bureaucracy on uniform standards. But first, let's do a bit of entertainment. This came from 1919, and it was meant for individuals who were still in the Army, and it's very early animation. So I hope you enjoy it. And that was from 1919. So, but also now sort of a pop quiz because I really don't have an answer for this. This is a photograph that was found in the collection. The gentleman in front, you see, has a campaign hat, U.S. Army uniform and attire, no type of indication a part of any military unit, and has armed Austro-Hungarian soldiers behind him. Now, the 332nd served in Italy, wore campaign hats, and literally fought Austro-Hungary in the final 2 weeks of the war. But there's, from what I've been able to research and tried to find out, I've not found any indication that there were any prisoners or any Americans that were taken captive during that event. So, what is this? There's nothing. So, if you have any ideas, let me know. I'd be happy to try to track down this little bit of knowledge because it truly has everyone from Jonathan downstairs to other individuals. We're going to put it out on the World War social media and post it there, hoping that someone might have an idea that way. But right now, everyone is coming up without a clue of what is, the indication of where this picture really, the indication of what it means. So, provide you a short, very short, and very abbreviated history of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It was the last vestige of Charlemagne and the Holy Roman Empire. The Habsburg dynasty is a story that spans centuries, and it came to an end in November 1918. The Habsburgs are not, descended from Charlemagne, but are the successors in the Holy Roman Empire. It began in the 15th century, but it wasn't really considered the Austro-Hungarian Empire until during the Napoleonic period. And then the Holy Roman Empire was considered to have ended at that time. But that's not the topic. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, like all empires, was built on multiple countries, multiple active languages, and not including the various dialects, and two unique military chains of command because of what happened in 1867, and also due to two core languages of Austrian and Hungarian. The military became a tiered military, caste-like, and based on nationality and education. The result for the military was a bureaucratic management mishmash. Certain elements were very logical and efficient. The airplane and air group organization schema truly was well thought out and had a lot of logic put into it, as well as the artillery groups and such. But other parts, such as supplies, materials, ordnance, and was a nightmare. And that the uniforms and associated items of dealing with the uniforms varied between countries, the army groups, and even into the ranks and identifications. Now, the army was conscription based, but you could buy an officer. It's similar to the British, but it was generally a conscription based and on merit coming from military schools. There were three common groups, the common, the Hungarian, and the Austrian. But in the end, there were actually five beyond the common and such. There were the Royal Landwehr, which was referred to as the KUK here, which would be the common, which was the mix, the Hungarian army, or the Honved, the Imperial Army, which was the Austrian, and then the two different Landsturms, which were the militias. But that doesn't even count the more informal militias that had their own groups that were just generally sort of like the border police and such in some of the borders who supported the Landsturm. The artillery, on the other hand, it was similar to the air arm. While it was part of the army, they were a separate KK group. KK meaning it was Austrian itself. Now, The language was the best way to compare the language was all of the common language for the army was German. That said, the Germans were the officer class language spoken, as well as the documents, except for the Hungarian regiments. And that sort of led to the German to Hungarian and then anything else. So it ended up being similar to Sacagawea in the Lewis and Clark expedition when dealing with the enlisted people. Of the German officers would put out a notice which would have to be interpreted, translated, and transcribed into what the general enlisted population might be able to read. The officer class were either Austrian or Hungarian, and the senior officers were almost entirely Austrian, except for the Honved regiments. And the senior regiments officers were either royal upper class family or had some relationship similar to the Prussian style army families and such. But generally speaking, the enlisted men were a mix of all different lower economic classes and were mostly non-Austrian. There were Austrian members in the army coming out of Galicia and the more rural areas of Austria, but the majority came from everywhere around the empire. NCOs were the exception, but they were still a minority for anything. You would find Hungarian NCOs and lower level officers, but that were Hungarian or other nationalities, but they were a minority. The rank classification is similar and identical to German ranks, but here's an interesting little thing that I've been able to pick up from my studies. There were both officers and then privileged officers, and they had the same rank, but had increased social rank, and indicators were indicated by small things. All the swords and bayonet short swords might have a sword knot or portepee, but the size of the portepee or how big the portepee is can indicate the importance of the officer, even though it was the same rank. Same thing with the boots and the cap. You'll find variants, and this is one of the things that would be just sort of pull your hair out when you're trying to identify all the different things. And then finally, the collar badges itself. So it was very confusing and somewhat difficult for me to determine, unless really blowing up the pictures up close. And it's even worse 100 years later with these black and white photos. So military rank identification would be determined by stars, star color and type, and there would be gold, silver, brass, or even cloth. The underlay cloth, which would indicate the regimental and also by a vertical stripe or a dot, and then the underlay braid and the color of the braid. But in the field, officers would use their underblouse or undershirt to obscure the rank to prevent from being a target. So, which of these has the highest rank? You might think it was the gold braid underneath, but it's actually the bronze up in the upper right hand corner. And the one that's black with the cloth stars, those cloth stars could have actually just been silver or brass stars themselves. So the one in the upper corner was an Oberst lieutenant, and the one down in the lower left-hand corner was the Millet lieutenant. And while the two stars with the black was just a corporal. So here were the way that the underlay colors would be allocated, both in German versus Hungarian. And you can see that the dark red up in the top was allocated to the 1st, 18th, 52nd, and 53rd regiments. And then where it might get a little confusing is that the pike gray and light blue were actually colors in the uniform. So it might be hard to tell the difference when you're dealing with the 11th or 24th, whether there was actually a cloth patch down at the bottom. But it made a huge difference of what colors there were, and that there were check regiments that were literally dissolved because of some actions that they participated in. So the different uniforms is, like I said, is very confusing, but even trying to identify the styles over time was primarily seen in the blouse or blouse, and each style superseded the other, but it did not require replacement. So you could have uniforms for an entire regiment having multiple, and that the primaries are the ones in bold, the M1908 or M08, and the M1915 or the M16. Don't ask me why. It must have been done at the end of 1915, but it's referred to as the M16 style. But some M1900 blouses are still seen into 1916 by the soldiers. And there are some references when I was doing my research don't detail this impact as a whole. So here's how it's generally presented when you look at the pictures and such. You have these soldiers that all have the same general color. They might have small differences in the pants color. And that in the one picture where the gentlemen have the two proficiency lanyards, one is Hungarian because he does not have a bill. The other one, two have bills on their caps. And then the three gentlemen in their field coats have very similar styles. But it doesn't work out that way when you really start to do research. That you find that there's small to major variants where you have the one gentleman has the light gray blouse, the other one has the darker gray blouse. The three gentlemen have three different styles of coats, which are kind of hard to see, but they are all unique in their own way. And then you have one gentleman that has a button cuff bottom pants, the other one has knee boots. And that doesn't mean that they're necessarily part of different groups. It's how they bought their uniform for the officers. And if you notice, you can't generally tell at this point, because this is post 1916, what the rank is easily. So here's also a good example of the reality. The reality is that you have gentlemen with in the top, you see some gentlemen without bill type caps that look sort of almost American, but those are the Hungarians. You see some that have the stiff side. You see some that have the flat top. The senior officers in the center is standing with their swords, have flat type hats, caps. But the blouses range in various different colors just because of the lack of standardization. And even when you get into senior officers, here you see a mix of senior officers, and that you have a gentleman who's a hussar over on the far right with his fur-lined coat, jacket, collar, to the senior officers with this older style as the newer style, but one is a flat top cap that's in the very center. But you see others that just have swap over type collars, and we'll talk more about this in a moment. But even at the senior officer level, there was variance in the uniform style. So the reason why I say this is a basic example, these pictures were all dated from 1916, and you see four different blouse collar styles. You see in the upper corner, it's a small stand-up collar and a tall stand-up collar. You see in the lower, you see one that has a large fold-over collar with the regimental color, and the other gentleman has a fold-over collar, but he has the top obscured so you can't see his rank. So here's an example of through time. You have at the very far left a gentleman holding his gloves, the black flat top cap with the button front, the stand-up collar, and he has a navy. It's not really black. It's not really navy color for his blouse. That is buttoned down with brass buttons. The Hussar, Cavalryman, Dragoon in the next picture is around 1916 as well. He has boots with stirrups as well as the peleves that is wrapped around his shoulder, which is the way you can tell. He also has a brimless cap that usually indicates that he is a Hungarian. The center one is a summer weight jacket, summer weight blouse and pants, which are light. Those would be cotton, and that they're not rare. It's just that most of the time you'd only see them out in the southern field. It was amazing that you would see gentlemen in the snow that would be wearing standard clothing that you would think it's too cold to wear, just a blouse and a jacket, but that's what they were wearing. The next picture the gentleman has a black armband, and his style and such indicates that he's post Franz Joseph's death, with the collar, the large fold-over collar, the black armband in mourning for Franz Joseph. And the final one is what was considered the modern uniform, which was the 1918 uniform with a very soft collar and very baggy style blouse. So this is where you'd see the primary variation. We're in the blouse styles. We're in the collar, the epaulettes, the buttons, the placket, the pocket cover, the sleeve, and the cuff. And you would find this when I had so many to choose from, I really couldn't make a choice because there were some that literally had changes all the way across. What's worse is that the seamstress seemed to be whoever they could get off the street at times, because the pockets would be mismatched for heights. So here's a good example again of blouse variants. Some of these are repeats from prior pictures, but you can see that they all have slight differences. The one that has the white fold over in the lower center he has a corduroy blouse, which was interesting in itself. They would, in certain areas, use a cotton corduroy for summer dress rather than the wool blouse, such as others. Then you get into the field cap variations. Now, here's the thing that I have it as the final bullet. I don't know whether it was a fatalistic attitude, but you very rarely, among the thousands of images that I've dealt with thus far, see gentlemen with a steel helmet. The only time they seem to be wearing a steel helmet would be right before they would go into battle, or if there was actually a battle setting. Otherwise, they were wearing their field caps. Even when they were doing artillery work, you could tell they were wearing just a field cap. Now, the primary types and styles was the kepi style, a slouch, a Tyrolean style, which looked more like a double build on the side, and you'd even see fez by the Bosnia-Herzegovinian and also the Muslim troops that would be serving in the empire. And then the build versus non-build versus the bill size of the cap. The cap bill, when it's non-build, would generally be Hungarian, but that was not 100% assured. But when you look at a picture that was non-build, if there was text on the back, the majority of the time, vast majority of the time, I'd be dealing with all were Hungarian or Czech. There would also be put badges. It's similar to the thing of trading badges with friends and family, because there were some that literally wondered how the cap stayed on their hat because they had so many badges. And the badges both indicated at times rank, but also where they've served. That was beyond just a medal. It was more of, this was proof that they had served there, and they were inexpensive ways to show proof. Now, on the imperial armies, you would always see either evergreen, edelweiss, or a flower sprig in their caps at the very beginning of the war. As the war progressed, these would change to badges, and they'd be an evergreen sprig badge or an edelweiss sprig badge. So here we see 6 different caps. 2 look alike, but they're different on the far left. But the ones in the center, one is a flat top with the man with the puppy, has a K for Emperor Karl badge on the front, where the one above is a stiff-sided and it has an FJI, so it's pre-Franz Joseph's death. The one in the upper corner without the bill is Hungarian, and the lower one is what's considered a modern style. And you can see a single stripe, if you look carefully, there's a single stripe on the collar and a button to indicate rank. So when you look at the other uniform parts for variation, it was the belt, the halter, the pants style, as I spoke of before, leggings, boots, and the uniform colors. Now, here's a good example of the different uniform parts examples where you see that you have an officer who at the very end is wearing a 1918 on the far left uniform with a bayonet, probably to be acting as his rank, as well as spat style leggings. Then the next one over with the gentleman with the very thin cavalry almost style sword, and then the one next to him also is wearing a sword, but instead of leather gaiters, he has cloth wrapped leggings. The next one has knee style boots, and the final one on the far left has cuffed style pants that were buttoned at the bottom. So when I'm trying to do evaluation for this project, you have this one picture on the left of the 3 soldiers, and so I blow it up, looking at the various different ranks, and that all 3 have a similar type badge behind their rank of the stars, and you can see the one gentleman has 2 stars, the other 2 have just a single star with the regimental colors. And one gentleman, the center gentleman with the 2 stars, has the stand-up collar type. And then if you also look, you can see that they all have sprigs at the very top to the side of a greenery of subtype. What's interesting is in the first photo on the far left, the gentleman up on top that's just lounging above the wattle it has a Hungarian style cap. So when you look at even like company level, you'll find odd men out where you see the one gentleman on the far left, who is wearing the lighter color, and the rest of the gentlemen are wearing what was called the dark gray or muted gray, and which was specific for machine gun companies. And then you see the 2 gentlemen kneeling beside the Schwarzlows. But yeah, if you look, when I blow this picture up, you would see the collars differences between all of them. At the same time, if you look at the gentleman in the center, the officer, he still has the older flat style cap, where there's more than a few gentlemen that have billless caps. The one that's kneeling on the right side has a billless who's Hungarian, and there's another Hungarian. So it's interesting. One final point to note is that no matter how dirty or worn the uniform was, the Austro-Hungarian soldiers and officers wore their medals on their blouse no matter what. It was a badge of honor, and that they would wear them in all types of scenarios. Here you see 3 officers posing, and the first one is the most likely the one to see action in the field because he has his collar covered so you can't see his rank while he holds the Steyr M95 carbine. And the two that are holding the machine gun Schwarzenegger's, the one is holding a binoculars, but they are higher rank and they probably are just posing in this image. Finally, the gentleman who is actually likely to see real action has a 1917, 1918 style uniform. And he is if you look down at the bottom, he has his member of the machine gun company, second of the sixth, field post number 361. So that would be his postmark. And so that's a different story in itself, is the postmarks that were found on these photographs and postmarks. So to summarize, my attempt was to show that you could have 5 soldiers from the same regiment with 5 totally different looking uniforms. A company or even a platoon equivalent could have different blouse styles and colors, different cap styles and colors, different uniforms, and not just due to rank, and still be part of the same unit. And one of the things that was very telling was, as the war progressed, the poorer the quality of the uniform and more substitution for colors would be utilized. Thank you for your time, and I'll try to answer any questions that you might have.
Very good. Well, thank you, Stephen. That's an interesting project. Do you think that a lot of the variation in uniforms is simply due to people not being able to buy as many uniforms as they might need?
That's a good question. The thing is, there's this one picture of, I hope I heard your question correctly, that it was a depot for giving out uniforms, and there was stacks of pants, stacks of caps, but very few shirts. And so it's like they wore out the blouses faster than anything else.
Well, that would make sense, although in most armies, the enlisted get issued clothing and the officers purchase
True.
them.
True.
And
And that's one of the things that was very obvious, is that the higher the rank of the officer, the more likely they had a quality uniform, and they probably had it bought in Vienna or one of Innsbruck or one of the places that they could literally purchase it from a higher quality tailor rather than taking the straight supplies. The NCOs, not so much.
right. Well, the NCO didn't have as much money.
True.
What about the canes that they carried? Were they used like swagger sticks of the British Army, or were they used as weapons?
They were used as both ornamental and actual use. From what I've been able to determine, canes were used. Keep in mind, the trenches in the Eastern Front, at least the pictures that I've seen of the Eastern Front, are not the same sort of developed mud holes of the Western Front. But they would still, the canes were generally used to sort of act as a probe for the dirt as much as anything. Now, one thing that I don't have, but there's a whole number of pictures. The soldiers that were of the mountain squads and such, they would have hiking poles and snow poles. And these poles were as tall as the soldier, if not taller. And they would use those for a multiple number of different purposes.
Interesting. What are porta-pies? You mentioned that earlier in the lecture.
The porta-pay, you mean?
Yeah.
The porta-pay is the sword knot. It's the little bulb that would be on the handle of the sword. And they generally use the French term rather than sword knot, which was interesting when I was looking at doing the research. the sword knot. And the thing is that the sword knot looked sort of like a small apple to, I saw some on there that were about the size of a plum or a tennis ball to as large as a Jonathan or a delicious apple, and that they would always have the fringe. And the whole idea was different. They were a status at that point more than anything else, because swords had become as quite simply archaic and obsolete.
Kelton here, the portapi or portapi, they are color coded by division and rank, and that's the Germans were very sophisticated, and the Army, the Navy, the Luftwaffe, the political people, and it's a decoration that goes back, and on the sword, it helped to in early times. You could hang on to your sword, and sometimes you really would be better off disposing of it and in battle, and you just didn't want to be tethered to it. But it never went away. But it's a color coded decoration, and the colors. There are charts that the other armies used, and it also helps to note rank. Thank you.
And that's where I was talking about the difference between a superior officer, because you would have a lieutenant who might have a silver portepee versus a lieutenant that you could tell had a gold or a bronze portepee. So it literally, there was a certain level of status. Now, something that I didn't mention is that what they would do is that they would take the portepees and they would use short swords, and that they would use actually Russian bayonets had been captured, because the Russian bayonets were almost sword length, but they weren't quite, where the bayonet that went on the M95 Steyr was all of about 8 to 10 inches long, and the longer into the war, it became more and more primitive till it finally, 1918, the bayonet was nothing but a steel handle that went into the frog that to hold the blade. It was not very ornamental. There was no wood at all on it.
All right. Well, Steve, thank you very much. I do want to thank everybody for attending.